Johnny Cash was banned for a decade after what he did on this stage.
The stage lights at the Grand Ole Opry felt different that night in 1965. Hotter, maybe. Or maybe it was just the air in the room changing as Johnny Cash walked to the microphone, dragging his boot heels across the wooden planks in a way that made the sound technicians wince. He'd been drinking. That much was obvious to anyone who'd been backstage in the previous hour. But Johnny Cash drunk wasn't unusual for the Opry in those years. Half the performers had their demons. Most people looked the other way. What happened next, though? Nobody looked away from that. And the Grand Ole Opry, the sacred institution of country music, would make certain Johnny Cash understood exactly what crossing that line cost. If you're here because you want the stories nobody sanitizes, the moments that reveal character when the cameras are supposed to be off, consider subscribing. We're not here for legends, we're here for truth.
The Grand Ole Opry in 1965 wasn't just a venue. It was country music's Vatican. The Ryman Auditorium stage was where careers were made, where legends were coronated, where the establishment decided who belonged and who didn't. There were rules, unspoken mostly, but everyone knew them. You respected the stage. You respected the audience. You respected the tradition that stretched back decades before you were born. You showed up sober enough to perform. You wore what was expected. You played your set. You thanked the audience. You moved off stage to let the next performer have their moment. Johnny Cash knew these rules. He'd performed at the Opry dozens of times. He'd been inducted as a member in 1956, which meant something in that world. It meant you were family, you were trusted, you were part of something larger than yourself. But by 1965, Johnny was unraveling in ways that made people uncomfortable. The pills had gotten worse, amphetamines to stay awake, barbiturates to come down, a cycle that left him unpredictable and raw-nerved. His marriage was collapsing. His career was thriving commercially, but spiritually he was hollowed out, performing because that's what the machine required, not because he had anything left to give. June Carter watched him deteriorate. So did the other Opry members. They'd seen performers crash before. This was a business that ran on heartbreak and self-medication. But Johnny's decline felt different, more public, more defiant. He'd started showing up late, missing cues, arguing with stage managers about set times and song choices. The Opry management tolerated it because Johnny Cash sold tickets, because his name on the marquee meant packed houses and national attention. But tolerance has limits. On this particular Saturday night in October, Johnny had been backstage drinking whiskey straight from a bottle hidden in his guitar case. Not sipping, drinking with purpose, like a man trying to blur something he didn't want to face. June had tried to talk him down. "You don't have to perform tonight. Tell him you're sick. Nobody will—" "I'm fine." "Johnny, you're not fine. You can barely stand." "Then I'll sit. I'll play sitting down." But he didn't sit. When his name was called, Johnny Cash walked onto that stage with the kind of deliberate, heavy steps that told everyone watching, something is wrong here. The audience applauded. They always applauded. That's what you did at the Grand Ole Opry. You showed respect for the performers, whether you knew their music or not, because this was church and these were the saints. Johnny stood at the microphone, swaying slightly. He started to play I Walk the Line, which should have been safe, familiar, the kind of song you could perform in your sleep. But halfway through the first verse, he stopped, just stopped playing, let the guitar fall silent while the house band scrambled to figure out if this was intentional or if something had gone wrong. Johnny looked out at the audience, well-dressed families, tourists who'd saved up for this trip, Opry members sitting in the reserved section, and his expression shifted into something that wasn't quite contempt, but wasn't far from it either. "You know what this place is?" His voice came out slurred, but loud enough that everyone heard. "This place is a museum, dead music for dead people who want everything to stay exactly like it was in 1940. The audience went silent. the kind of silence that feels like the air being sucked out of a room. Backstage, stage managers were already moving. June Carter had her hand over her mouth. The house band looked at each other, unsure whether to keep playing or stop. Johnny kept talking. Y'all come here every Saturday night, dress up nice, applaud at the right times, pretend like nothing's changed out there in the world, pretend like people aren't dying, pretend like this country isn't tearing itself apart, pretend like music is supposed to be safe and comfortable, and that's when he turned and kicked out one of the stage lights.
Not accidentally, deliberately. His boot connecting with the footlight assembly hard enough that glass shattered and the bulb exploded in a shower of sparks. Have you ever watched someone destroy something they loved because they didn't know how else to express what they were feeling? Have you ever been that person? Drop a comment if this hits different for you. The audience gasped. Some people stood up, unsure whether to leave or stay. Parents covered their children's eyes, not because of what Johnny had done, but because of what he might do next. Johnny kicked another light, then another, moving down the stage systematically, destroying the footlights one by one, while the opera staff rushed from backstage, trying to figure out how to stop this without making it worse. He wasn't yelling, wasn't violent toward any person. He was just methodically destroying the stage infrastructure with his boot heel. Each kick punctuated by the sound of breaking glass and the audience's collective shock. June Carter was the one who finally reached him. She walked onto that stage in front of 2,000 people and put her hand on Johnny's arm. "That's enough," she said quietly. Not angry, not scared, just present. Johnny looked at her. For a moment, it seemed like he might keep going, might turn his destruction towards something else. Then something in his expression collapsed. The defiance drained out of him all at once, leaving just exhaustion. He let June guide him off stage while the audience sat in stunned silence, and the house band tried to figure out what to play next to restore some semblance of normalcy to a night that had just been violently torn apart. If what Johnny did that night matters to you, if you think some destruction reveals more than it destroys, hit that subscribe button. Not because I'm asking, because these stories deserve witnesses.
Backstage was chaos. Opry officials were already calculating damages. The stage lights would cost hundreds of dollars to replace, significant money in 1965. Insurance would cover it, probably, but that wasn't the point. The point was that Johnny Cash had violated something more important than property. He'd violated the sacred contract between the Grand Ole Opry and its audience. He'd turned their Saturday night ritual into something uncomfortable and confrontational. He'd reminded everyone that country music wasn't always polite, that it came from people who hurt, who struggled, who sometimes couldn't contain what they were carrying inside. And the Opry establishment wanted no part of that reminder. Johnny was escorted out of the building before the show even ended. Not thrown out, the Opry was too dignified for scenes, but guided firmly toward the exit by security who'd been told to handle this quietly. June went with him. She didn't have to. She was scheduled to perform later in the evening. But she chose to leave with Johnny rather than stay and distance herself from what he'd done. In the car ride back to his house, Johnny was silent. Not sullen, not defiant, just empty. "They're going to ban you," June said finally. "You know that." "Yeah." "For years, probably. Maybe permanently." "Yeah." "Was it worth it?" Johnny looked out the window at Nashville passing by in the darkness. "I don't know." And that might have been the most honest thing he'd said all night. The Grand Ole Opry didn't announce Johnny Cash's ban. There was no press release, no public statement. That wasn't how these things worked. They just stopped inviting him to perform. When Johnny's management reached out about scheduling, they were told the calendar was full. Maybe next season, maybe the season after that. Other members were told not to advocate for him. The message was clear. Johnny Cash had crossed a line, and there would be consequences until he demonstrated he understood what those lines meant. The ban lasted over a decade.
Other venues followed the Opry's lead. If the Grand Ole Opry had deemed Johnny Cash too unpredictable, too dangerous, too disrespectful of tradition, then maybe smaller venues should be cautious too. Johnny's commercial success didn't suffer much. His records still sold, his concerts still drew crowds, but there was a cost nonetheless. The cost of being officially outside the establishment, of having burned a bridge to the institution that was supposed to validate your place in country music history. June Carter stayed. Through the ban, through the continued drug abuse, through the arrests and hospitalizations and public humiliations, she stayed because she saw something in Johnny that he couldn't see in himself during those years, potential for redemption that existed beneath all the destruction. Johnny eventually got sober, eventually made peace with the Opry, eventually was invited back and received standing ovations from audiences who'd forgiven him, or who'd never known about that October night in 1965, or who understood that sometimes people destroy things when they're drowning and don't know how else to signal for help. But the moment itself, the image of Johnny Cash systematically kicking out stage lights while the Grand Ole Opry audience watched in horror, that became part of his legend. Part of the mythology of Johnny Cash as the man who wouldn't be contained by institutions or expectations. What people forget, though, is what it actually cost him. Not just the ban, not just the relationships damaged or the opportunities lost. It cost him his own respect for himself. Because destroying something you love doesn't make you free. It just makes you someone who destroys things. And Johnny spent the next decade trying to figure out how to rebuild what he'd broken. Not just the stage lights, but the trust, the connections, the sense that he belonged somewhere. If this story moved you, if you understand that rebellion sometimes looks like self-destruction and recovery sometimes takes longer than anyone wants, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me, have you ever destroyed something you loved? What did it teach you?
This wasn't just about stage lights or institutional rules or a man who'd had too much to drink. It was about what happens when pain has no language, when the gap between who you're supposed to be and who you actually are becomes unbearable, when destruction feels like the only honest communication left. Johnny Cash kicked out those lights because he was drowning and didn't know how else to say it. The Grand Ole Opry banned him because institutions protect themselves from chaos, even when that chaos is just a human being falling apart in public. And June Carter stayed because sometimes love means being present for someone's worst moments without trying to fix them or flee from them. None of these responses were wrong. None of them were right. They were just what happened when someone crossed an unspoken line and everyone had to decide what that crossing meant. Thanks for watching. If this story matters to you, subscribe. Share it with someone who'd understand why some moments define us more than our accomplishments. And remember, the lines we cross don't always lead us away from home. Sometimes they're the only path back.